Welcome to session 22. We're going to be looking at the last few spiritual gifts. So this is going to be spiritual gifts part 4. And I want to look at the last few gifts, and then I want us to kind of look, take a big picture look at spiritual gifts to help us appreciate their value. So the first gift I want to talk about is workings of mighty powers or miracles. So it comes from the Greek word energemata dunameon, or meon, and this means workings of mighty powers or miracles. And this is basically the capacity to perform acts contrary to natural laws with God's mighty power, which demonstrates his authoritative presence, especially in the gospel. So oftentimes this gift will be accompanied with the preaching of the gospel, especially when we're preaching the gospel to places that haven't heard it yet. And so this is a very valuable spiritual gift. Now, miracles may include deliverance from physical danger, powerful works of judgment on enemies of the gospel or those who require church discipline, could include miraculous deliverance from injury, or it could also include triumph over demonic opposition. And I encourage you to look at all these verse references to see how this gift unfolds in different situations. So again, this is a very important gift. This is one we should expect to see, especially as we faithfully preach the gospel and bring it to places where the gospel hasn't been heard or received yet. The next gift I want to talk about is the gift of healing. This comes from the Greek word charismata iamaton, and the definition here is the capacities to heal diseases miraculously. Now, perhaps this gift includes being able to discern how to pray for healing that are specific to different kinds of needs. And so pretty self-explanatory. Now, Walt Russell offers this input. He says, the plural form of the words gifts and healings may indicate that this is an ability that is given repeatedly, perhaps at special times rather than on demand. So Walt Russell, he says, when this gift is mentioned, it's mentioned in the plural, which may suggest that it's given repetitively at certain times, and it's not something really on demand. And I think that would cohere with experience pretty well, right? I mean, we've all prayed for people at various times and they haven't been miraculously healed. And so I think that's just a reminder that at the end of the day, we have to submit to God's will. God is sovereign. He determines when a gift is given, including the gift of healings. Now, the next gift I want to talk about is one that in the Charismatic Church we appreciate very much, and that's speaking in tongues. And that's from the Greek word glosson, and this means kinds of languages or tongues. Also comes from the Greek word glossais lalusin, and this means to speak with languages or tongues. Now, the definition here is this is the capacity to speak to God or to his people in praise or prayer in an unlearned known language, like in Acts chapter 2, or an unknown language, like a heavenly language. Both are unlearned and not understood by the speaker. Speaking in tongues or languages should not be forbidden, but should be orderly, and the language interpreted in the assembly as part of public praise and prayer. So, speaking in tongues, the second kind, the one that's it's unknowable, very valuable for private prayer. This is a way that we're able to kind of to offer up those prayers that we know that we cannot put words to. Prayers that are sometimes our heart has cries that are so deep that we just can't put words to it, and that's where speaking in tongues really helps us. But when it's done in the local assembly, we should seek an interpretation. And that brings us to the next spiritual gift, which is interpreting tongues. And this comes from the Greek word hermenea, glosson, interpretation of tongues. And the definition here is the capacity to interpret the meaning of a tongue, although the interpreter has not learned the language or it is an unknown language. Now, how does this actually look? And, a lot of people would say that this is a very rare gift, but I think it's more common than we might suspect. And I'll give you an example. Something I noticed is that when I'm in a prayer gathering, a lot of times people will be speaking in tongues, and oftentimes after a period of time where people are speaking in tongues, someone will get a prophetic word. And I believe a lot of times what they're receiving is not actually a prophecy separate from the tongues. Rather, they're receiving the interpretation of those tongues that are being spoken. So what I would encourage us to do is when people are speaking in tongues in a corporate setting, we should be praying and asking God, give us an interpretation. Give us a prophetic word that is an interpretation of what's being spoken in tongues. And a lot of times what's going to happen is God will give you the interpretation in the form of a prophetic word. So I want to encourage you to seek this gift, especially when people are speaking in tongues in large group gatherings. Now, to end our discussion on spiritual gifts, I want us to reflect on a passage that helps us to understand the nature of spiritual gifts and help us see spiritual gifts within the context of Jesus' triumph over death and the demonic powers. And I think this is just going to make us appreciate spiritual gifts even more. And it's Ephesians 4, 7-10. It says this, but to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive the captives, and he gave gifts to people. Now, this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens so that he might fill all things. So what's incredible here is Paul is connecting spiritual gifts with Christ's ascension and his victory over death and the demonic forces. So what he's saying is that when Jesus ascended into heaven, he basically led a procession of the captives, the spiritual forces that he defeated. I believe it's in Colossians where it talks about how Christ humiliated the spiritual forces of this world. And so in Jesus' ascension, he basically humiliated and conquered the spiritual forces of this world. And as another way to put it is he plundered the spiritual forces. And the plunder of his victory is the spiritual gift. So basically, spiritual gifts in the local church are the plunder of Jesus' victory over death and over Satan. It's a reminder that Jesus Christ has conquered the grave, he's conquered Satan, he's conquered all the spiritual forces. And this is, I love how this is tied to like a military victory. So oftentimes if an army conquered an enemy, they would lead a procession celebrating their victory, often, humiliating their foes, and they might even pass out gifts and plunder to the people. And that's what Jesus Christ did. When he ascended into heaven, he gave gifts to the local church in the form of spiritual gifts as plunder of his victory and as a way to celebrate his victory again over death and the spiritual forces. So just a reminder that every time we use spiritual gifts, it's a reminder of Christ's victory. Spiritual gifts are the plunder of Jesus' conquest over death and Satan. So with that, I just want to highlight a few points here. This passage sheds light on a different aspect of God's grace. While Ephesians chapter 2 tells us about God's saving grace, Ephesians chapter 4 tells us about God's serving grace. And while God's grace is the result of, while God's saving grace is a result of the atonement, God's serving grace is a result of the ascension. Spiritual gifts are the spoils of Jesus' triumphant victory over death and every principality. So remember that the next time you are using spiritual gifts in the local assembly.